Welcome to Whiskey Lore, The Interviews. I'm your host, Drew Hanish, the Amazon bestselling author of Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Kentucky Bourbon, and also the bestselling author of Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Irish Whiskey. And today, I have a special treat for you guys, somebody I've been wanting to have on the show for quite some time, and we have had this in the works, and it's finally come to fruition. And somebody who has provided me with 3 outstanding whiskeys from 50, 70, and 90 years in the past, and I'm going to throw in an additional one that we're going to taste together that is a 100-year-old whiskey as of this particular year. And the man I'm talking about is Dusty Dan. Dusty Dan, I'm telling you right now, welcome to the show, and I can't wait to dig into these whiskeys, but we'll do some background first. How about that?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for again for having me on. I know it's been a long time coming. We've been talking about this for a while, and definitely excited to be here this evening with you. So thank you.
Yeah, we get to talk a little whiskey, talk a little history, and then taste a little whiskey history on top of that. So kind of, for me, my journey into Dusty's was kind of a dream and a hope after I heard that the Jack Rose Dining Saloon up in Washington, D.C. did these pre-prohibition whiskey tastings. And I thought just to be able to taste one would be amazing. And then I got invited out to California and had an opportunity to taste 24, which blew my mind to be able to do that. And I got to bring some back with me. And I had been following you for some time previous to that, kind of interested in your journey with Dusty bottles. And so let's get started before the Dusties and say, how long have you been a whiskey drinker?
I mean, honestly, probably. I enjoyed whiskey when I was a little bit younger, but never really got into it like I did here recently. I'd say maybe 5 to 5.5 years now at this point is kind of really where my journey began. And it was very odd, the timing in which it happened. I was flipping through some YouTube, and I came across Horst Leuning, and he was reviewing
Mr. Gulp.
Yeah,
I call him Mr. Gulp.
He was reviewing some Elijah Craig barrel proof, some of the old Tombstone bottles, the older style. And I was just watching him, and he was, coming off with all these tasting notes, and I was like, no way, like how where's all this coming from? So one thing led to another, and obviously I wasn't able to find that bottle at the time, but I watched another one of his reviews and was kind of tasting with him side by side, and it took me a little while to kind of get used to that on the palate, to get that alcohol, to get past the alcohol, and that's kind of where my journey began. I kind of just I fell in love with it, and I kind of started tuning into some other channels, and then following them as they did live streams, and as they were tasting along, I'd go out and find that bottle. So that's really how my journey began.
Okay, and so were you a foodie or anything before then, or I mean, how did you develop your own palate after watching all of that? Was it just watching the videos?
Yeah, I mean, I had I didn't have a crazy major background in food. I had worked in the industry for a very short period of time. But yeah, I mean, really just that's something I've really took a lot of kind of pride in, if you will, is training my palate. And I mean, again, it took me a while. Like, obviously, taste is subjective, but for me, I always try to like bring back a memory if I can of like, my grandmother made this, or my mom made this kind of snack, and this is kind of what it relates to. But a lot of times too, I'm really big on tasting different things and kind of memorizing that. And I mean, I've laid out different samples of like herbs and all these different kind of candies, and kind of paired them with whiskeys and what I can pull out of it. I do that a lot, surprisingly, and I think it's helped me over that course of time. To improve not only my nose, but my palate.
For me, getting into all of this, I have to say that I really had no sense of smell. I knew if something smelled really good, or if I knew if something tasted really good, but I couldn't tell you really the components of the flavors.
Yeah.
And so when I would watch, my guy was Ralphie when I started doing, and he would rattle off 25 things. And I'm going, how the heck are you coming up with 25 things out of that whiskey? And what really helped me with that was it was forcing me to really dig beyond and say, let me find some of those deeper flavors and scents and really get.
It's hard for a lot of people. There's some friends of mine who are newly into getting into whiskey, and it's like I can't. They still are at that stage where they can't kind of get past that alcohol, and they're still trying to find something that can memorize it. And slowly but surely, it's like, hey, you know what? I'm actually starting to get some of these notes, and it's like you have to try to think of like a memory of something to kind of tie that to, and I mean, that's just for me. That's how I do it, and it's just become so like second nature to me, if you will. And I mean, Drew, I'd be honest with you, man. I'm a guy that'll go out and I'll taste a little piece of leather. I'll do this, I'll do that, just to know. I want to know what it tastes like. And
you're the guy.
When people ask me, like, how do you know what leather tastes like? It's like, I've tried it, man. I tried to taste it. It's that's what I do. So.
Okay, well, that's interesting because I actually had a friend specifically ask me that when I gave that note. He's like, I could tell you what tobacco tastes like because I smoke cigars, but I've never been walking around licking leather furniture.
Yep, I did. And that's me, guilty.
So you have to tell me, because really what I do, because the nose and the mouth are so interconnected,
yes.
To me, it really feels like sometimes by smelling something, you really are tasting it.
Yes.
Already, and that's very similar.
It is. It's. I mean, more so too. Obviously, aromas. Yeah, they have a huge part in the flavor of it as well. But it's sometimes, it does become odd when you smell something, but yet it doesn't. It doesn't translate to the palate. That happens with me oftentimes. I mean, more typically with more sweeter characters like a toffee or a butterscotch. Rather than something I get a lot of fruit on the nose. Usually I get that those fruity notes on the palate. So sometimes it's more of the sweeter kind of flavors or aromas that I don't necessarily get on that doesn't reflect on the palate.
Yeah. What was the first aha moment where you went, ooh, there's a scent that, I feel like I'm actually getting this?
Yeah, I remember this. So I was able to get, and it was one of my first dusty bottles that I found. It was an old Taylor. It was from I think it was like 1972 Old Taylor, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember trying it, and I was like this tastes like one of those little butterscotch, those little yellow candies. And I was like, this is crazy. Like, how is this really happening to me right now? I'm actually getting past the alcohol and tasting it. Now, it could have been that, it was a lower proof. Obviously that wasn't a high proof pour. But I was just able to pull out that butterscotch note, and I was like, wow, like this is like, this Horst Lunen guy, he knows what he's talking about. Like, there really are flavors behind the whiskey. That for me, I think, was my true aha moment, is when I was able to try that pour. Not only was it one of my first dusty bottle pickups, but it was also the aha moment where I was able to pick up that note outside of the alcohol.
Do you feel like for people who are just getting into whiskey that they should hold off on spending the money on the dusties and really kind of explore? Because it sounds like you jumped in fairly early on getting into the world of dusties.
I did, and unfortunately, it was a very expensive road to go down. So it was a rabbit hole that I wish I would have waited on a little bit, but. I do. I think that for anybody looking to get into whiskey, obviously, old whiskey is not what you want to start with. Again, there's a lot of differences in older whiskey compared to modern whiskey, and I know we can get into that a little bit later. But number one, the cost is just is crazy. But I think more so today, the flavors are very different from then till now, but. I think people should wait a little while. There's a lot of whiskey on the market now. I mean, it's almost to the point where it's oversaturated. People have a ton of options to choose from. I mean, you're talking, I don't even know how many states right now have actual whiskey out, but I'm sure it's well over half at this point. So yeah, I mean, it's easily accessible. It's and almost you can purchase it in almost every state, if not every state, if I'm not mistaken. But I would definitely say stick with the modern whiskey and hold off a little while until you get into that dusty whiskey. And then when you do, go and try a pour of it somewhere. Again, like you mentioned Jack Rose earlier, that's a great place to go. You can go down to Kentucky and go to the bar Neat or Bardstown Bourbon Company, and they have all those pours accessible there. So if you were to go down the dusty road, make sure you try a sample of a pour of it first before you go in like I did. So
do you have a whiskey that you bought early on that as your palate developed, you came back to it when the bottle was just about empty and you kicked yourself because you're like, man, I would have enjoyed this even more?
I did. It was actually it was one of the times I was able to pick up one of those the old school Elijah Craig Tombstone bottles. It was the 100 and I forget which batch it was off the top of my head, but it was that bottle, and I drank through it. It was obviously a higher proof whiskey, but I didn't appreciate it like I would have now. They are still accessible in certain markets, but I kind of wish that I would have held off on that bottle and not drank it so quickly, knowing what I know now.
Yeah, that was kind of my start into whiskey. I was very cautious about stepping in too far initially because in a way in my mind I said, $150, $200, $300 bottle of whiskey is going to be lost on me.
Yes.
It's like I just won't get out of it with somebody else. It's like I felt like there was a certain reverence I needed to have for something that sat for so long waiting for somebody to drink it. Or I mean, and we'll talk about this in a minute. You did some samples of Pappy Van Winkle here recently. That's a lot of money to spend on something where you may have somebody else who really could appreciate it. And to me, it almost feels like I'm wasting that on myself until I'm really ready for it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is. It's, and to your point, it's, I think a lot of what happens is there's always like especially for me, and now that I'm like really, really big into Dusties and buying big lots of Dusties, is it's always that fear of missing out on something for me, and that's kind of, what's kind of giving me that addiction to try to find these Dusties and hunt them down and collect and try. There's definitely a good handful that I haven't opened, but I mean, for the most part, I do open and share pretty much everything that I own right now. That's open. So. Yeah.
Well, I absolutely love that you shared whiskey with me because, this is a great opportunity for me too, to get a sense of different things. Our friend Todd Ritter, he and I we got together when I came back from California and went up to Colonel E.H. Taylor's gravesite and opened this bottle of Hermitage while looking down at where the old Hermitage distillery used to be. And it's funny when we did that, and he lives down there. He lives right near the footprint of where that distillery used to be. And here we are kind of soaking all of this in. Have you seen Highlander, the movie?
I have.
Yeah. Okay. It sort of reminded me of that moment when he's in his den and he's talking with his love interest, and he pulls out the bottle of cognac and he's like, 1791. Yeah. And then he's like, Mozart wrote the Magic Flute. And I'm going, that's what I was feeling while I was up there. It's kind of like you have these, and I do that with this because the Hermitage was distilled in 1914. And I go, that was the beginning of World War I. And that was, Woodrow Wilson was president, and those kinds of thoughts start going through my mind.
Yeah, it's really crazy. Like, I mean, for you, I'm sure that is always an experience too that you're going to remember, right? Like being right there, right by that distillery with a good friend, drinking whiskey that's insanely old. It is for me too. It's all about the experience. I bring a lot of these bottles to to events or to meetups and stuff like that because it really is about the experience. It's special whiskey that not everybody gets to enjoy. And for me, I really kind of I look forward to sharing it with people and having those experiences. That's what you truly remember is the experience in which you enjoyed it.
So talk about the how did you start finding these Dusties when you first started out? Did you have a store that had them? was collecting them, or did you? What was your process for finding them?
Yeah, so one of the things is when I first started out, there was actually a store pretty local to me that when you walked in, they had a lot of new stuff, but then behind the new stuff, they had these couple little, I forget what you call them, like étagères or something, if you will, like 3 shelved, had glass on them and all that. And, behind some of those bottles, there were some bottles that just had tons of dust on them. And I was like, are these for sale back here? And sure enough, they were. And that's kind of, so I was able to find some that way. Another way was kind of when the secondary market was kind of up and running, and I had reached out, and I had a group of people that I followed and all that, and I wound up getting into the secondary market, and they had a couple sites on the secondary market that you could purchase some of that old whiskey. So I went down that road more often than not, and then slowly as time went on, I got more into like the estate sale side of things and finding big lots that way, and that's really the for me those 3 are like where I find everything. So now I have I go through a couple sites, auction houses. I'll do estate sales and buy lots if available, but yeah, it's just. You gotta have that tight group of friends that you can trust in order to buy some of these bottles, because number one, they're expensive. Number two, you want to make sure you're inspecting them too to make sure there's no kind of tampering or anything like that. So
yeah, I was wondering how much now that whenever something gets popular, all of a sudden you have the issue with fakes coming out.
Yeah.
Is that an issue that you have to deal with?
Yes, very much so. It does happen. There are people out there that are masters of the art, unfortunately, as bad as it sounds, so one of the things that I tend to look at is, one of the first things is always the fill level of the whiskey. If the fill level is super low, it's evap, and is the whiskey going to be good anymore? Is it going to taste the same? And then from there is always looking at the tax strip, and that's always the tricky one. Some tax strips just look way too clean. They look way too manufactured, and it's like, how are these people able to do this? Sometimes, I've seen a couple bottles that you can even, I saw pictures of them. I didn't have to see them in person, but you can see that the tax strip looks like it was removed and then kind of glued back on. Because sometimes you can't necessarily tell from the outside, but if you can see through the glass to the other side and look at the inside of the tax strip, you can see that there's a different like a different colored glue than the opposite side. So I've seen that before. What's that there?
I was going to say I was going to hold this up, so if anybody's watching online, of course my camera's horrible at focusing when I want it to. This is an old Taylor from 1914 to 17.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. Yes, but that is one way. Is like, again, looking at the outside, it's very difficult to tell. But if you can see through the glass to the opposite side where you're looking at the inside of it, I've looked at it 2 different ways. You can see 2 different color glues. One was almost yellowed and the other one was clear. It's like, well, obviously there's some tampering going on here. So, and then the next step is looking at the cork, making sure the cork's not rotted. That's another big piece, making sure the cork's not too fresh, because obviously that's another issue, right? So, a lot of things kind of go into looking at fakes, and there is someone out there, and I won't call out any names, but there's a guy that really goes after people faking it on the secondary market, and he's done a fantastic job of trying to keep it as clean as possible. So.
That's nice. Yeah, it's interesting that you have to do detective work to buy whiskey.
Yeah, you do, but like I said, I have a group of guys who are will supply stuff to auction houses and run auction houses and stuff that I'll deal with personally. So if they have something I'm looking for, I will go through them way more than I'll go through the secondary market.
Yeah,
but going through an estate sale, it's kind of hard unless you have some friends with you and kind of look over some stuff. So it's sometimes it can be a hit or miss,
So when I'm sitting there while I'm watching a movie and it's based on something historical, I will pull up Wikipedia on my phone while I'm going through and check things out. Are you doing the same thing with bottles? Like, was this brand even around when this thing says it was that, or what is the history behind this whiskey?
Yes, and as and it's one of the crazy parts of whiskey. Like as it gets older, it went through so many different hands, right? So there's so much information out there about some of these older whiskeys. Like this person owned it, and then it shut down, and it came back under this person, and they shut down, right after Prohibition, and then came back in the 40s and 50s. So there's a lot of information to kind of follow, and I think I've done a pretty decent job of trying to track a lot of that information. Not obviously not through every company, but and I'll reach out to resources, right? Like I don't know it all, but I know people who know way more than I do. So I can, I have plenty of resources to reach out to see if, hey, so-and-so, does this look correct? Do these dates match up to this timeline? Because surprisingly enough, there are people that, again, who can manufacture these tax strips and make the mistake of putting wrong dates on there when it was distilled under this certain brand. So, that's, the stories and the history behind it is something that still draws me in. Like I still want to know more. I still want to learn more. And, that's another reason why the older whiskey is so special, because not only is it great whiskey, not only is it old whiskey, but you have the piece that ties in the history behind it too. So,
yeah. I had a bottle, and I wish I could have shared it with you, but I felt extremely lucky that I had the opportunity to taste it. It was while I was in Ireland, and I was at the Great Northern Distillery, John Teeling's distillery, and Brian Watts, the production director. We were chatting about whiskey, and he saw how passionate I was about it, and he said, I have a bottle you have to check out. So he pulls his bottle out, and it's this dilapidated brown bottle that looks very handmade and not very well handmade. And he said, we found this bottle underneath a barn in Tyrone, Ireland. And he says, we know it's dated back to the 1880s, but we're not quite sure, and there was liquid in it, and we had the liquid tested, and it is whiskey. So then he pulls another bottle down, and he goes, and so this is it. This is the liquid. He said, I'm going to pour you a little bit and see what you think about it. Now, this is one of those situations where, in me doing my own whiskey research, bottling whiskey is not something that really came about until the Bottled in Bond Act. Prior to that, everything was being stored in barrels, and you might have somebody bottle some special, but mass production of bottles was too expensive. So the opportunity to taste something that goes back that far is nearly impossible, which begs the question of what is the oldest whiskey that you have tasted?
Oldest whiskey that I've tasted was from 1906. It was in 1906. It was actually one of the old Overholts from 1906. I'm sure you've seen them with the white label. Just says old Overholt, and then just the little date at the bottom. Usually it's like a white label. That was all from the Mellon estates.
Nice.
So that's the oldest that I've tried personally. But again, you're absolutely right. Like, when you talk about older whiskey like that, and you're talking about, bottling lines and stuff, like, back then, whiskey was truly handmade. It really was. From A to Z, it was truly handmade. And then, as time went on, the bottling process began, and now it all comes down to you push a button and that's it, But back then, they didn't have that, so.
I know, it's funny. I'm doing all this research on Tennessee whiskey history, and for the last 3 weeks in a row, I've been stuck in the 19th century trying, looking at old advertisements and learning about all these old distillers, and you see the words handmade on a Jack Daniels, and you go, yes, that was handmade.
It's true though. It's going back. I mean, you can go look at old some older pictures and just see, like, they didn't have all that technology that we do now, and it truly was just such a handmade process and a real handmade whiskey. But it's just over time, it's so much has changed, everything, and I think with all of that from the past and then modern, but like that to me is why I think a lot of that whiskey tastes so different. I mean, there's a lot of different factors that go into that as well, not just that. But overall, I think that's why older whiskey has such a different flavor compared to modern day whiskey. So
Yeah. So if you could think back to well, first of all, let's talk about that old Overholt, because I'm really fascinated in a Pennsylvania whiskey that's now a Kentucky whiskey under the Beam brand, but initially it was one of the oldest distilleries, and Pennsylvania is known for their rye.
Yes.
And yes, this was probably coming up towards Prohibition, but it still was far enough away that I don't think anybody was slacking at all. And you were probably past the Whiskey Trust era by that point. I don't think Pennsylvania took part in it in the 20th century. So talk about the flavors of that one, because I'd be very curious about what a Pennsylvania rye tasted like back in that time period.
Yeah, so for me, so Overholt in general has typically come off as a fairly spicy type of rye, and even modern day Overholt still comes off a little spicy. But going back to like the National Distillers era, when they had their hand in it, that was really good. That to me didn't have as much of a bite of spice as modern day did. But then you go back to like the melon, like the melon estates, those older ones. To me, there was almost like it had its spice to it, but there was also, you got more of like that caramel, more your traditional kind of like bourbon flavors off of that. But yet that rye spice, that rye bite was kind of still there, and not even necessarily the grainy flavor, but just that big bold spice. Even though it was a lower proof. So you're getting those vanillas and those caramels, but then all of a sudden it's just like these sweet notes start to kind of hit the back of the palate and into the finish, and just kind of pulls down some of those spices as it continued. And it's not one of those where like the spices died off after the first sip. It offered that spice bite from sip to sip to sip. Just a wonderful experience. And again, it was one of my good buddies that allowed me to try a sample of that. So at the time. This was a while back.
So of all the whiskeys that you have tried, can you pick a standout? I know that's always a hard question. So what's your favorite bourbon? That's like, I hate that question.
Gosh, man, there's been so many that have just really just blew me away. I had. I mean, obviously the melon. I mean, that was fantastic. That was probably one of the best whiskeys I've probably ever tried. A few more. I mean, there's just so many. I mean, honestly, some of the you look at like the 1989 Old Grandad 114s that were distilled over by National Distillers. That stuff is phenomenal. It is amazing. Some of the old A.H. Hirsch, that stuff is really, really good. There's been stuff, honestly, out of Old Quaker Distillery, now modern day, Lawrenceburg, Indiana. Some of that stuff was just absolutely fantastic, even at a younger age. And then you go, I mean, the Old Crow Chessman, I have a piece back here behind me. Old Crow Chessman was absolutely fantastic, being 1969. So yeah, I mean, there's so many, and I mean, there's stuff from Kentucky Tavern. So Kentucky Tavern is probably one of my favorite brands as a whole. Everything from like the Captain's Quart bottles to the older bottled and bonds. That cherry note that you get on there with that vanilla and that caramel, that rich kind of vanilla fudge. Oh man, it's to die for.
And now you find that on the bottom shelf.
No, right?
In the modern
so
version.
Crazy how that works.
Yeah. Well, what distillery is that coming out of? Barton?
That's new. I believe it is. Yes, the old stuff came out of Glenmore.
Oh, okay. Out of Owensboro.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
And that stuff it's some of my favorite stuff, to be honest.
Really?
With you. I have stuff that goes back from I had 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s from old Glenmore. So fantastic stuff. I'll send you a sample of something.
Nice.
So you can try it. Yeah.
The interesting thing is, I talked to a guy a long time ago. He's a soccer fan, I was a hockey fan, and we were chatting back and forth. And I said, I bet you I could turn you on to my sport. And he said, well, I bet you I could turn you on to mine. And I said, well, the first thing you have to do is you have to pick a favorite team. And if you pick a favorite team, then all of a sudden you have like it helps get your emotions up. You know, all of a sudden it's not just a puck going around or a ball being kicked around, and you have some skin in the game on it. So when it came to whiskey, I think I kind of used that philosophy and said, I need to find a brand that has some history behind it, and I need to latch on to that, and I need to kind of baseline and get to know that particular whiskey. And for me, that's Old Crow, because Old Crow, to me, it has all that history behind it, and there's plenty of legacy to go through. And this is where Todd's been really helpful for me, because he sent me a couple of Old Crows to try. And so I've been back in the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, and he and I actually went out to, we're talking about, we may have to do a website that's drink whiskey at the grave kind of thing, because we were at Dr. James C. Crow's gravesite. Yep. Drinking a 1970s Old Crow. And it's amazing to me that whiskey has, you can tell that it's not, at that time, it wasn't a top shelf whiskey, but it had such a nice kind of milky character to it, and just the flavors were so rich. Yeah. They kind of faded quickly, and I think that's where you felt like you weren't drinking the top shelf stuff, but it was still such an amazing experience, even to be tasting those lower shelf whiskeys.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. In that, in that era, that's still under National Distillers, and National Distillers gets a lot of praise for the stuff that they had put out. The stuff that they had their hands in they had their hands in a lot of stuff. And to me, that's another, you talk about, obviously they're not a brand, but, National Distillers as a whole, I think, is another probably one of my favorites, because, again, the Old Crows that you mentioned, the Old Grandad 114s, just the regular Old Granddads. But they had their hand in a lot of stuff, and I've always been a big fan of a lot of stuff. Old Taylor, a lot of the stuff that they put their hands in, I've been a big fan of. I just think the flavor profiles from when they had it and the flavor profiles from when others had it, there's just a night and day difference. So
that's really interesting. What's fascinating about that is digging into the history of National Distillers. Seton Porter, their president, was the one who started buying up all of the old stocks of whiskey during Prohibition so that he could come out guns a-blazing if they ever repealed it, which they did, luckily. Otherwise, he'd have been drinking a lot of straight whiskey on his own. But then the world wanted blends. And so when he stepped out of the business in the early 1950s, the guy he turned it over to was not interested. He was a teetotaler, and he had no interest in whiskey. He wanted to make industrial alcohol, and that's really the direction that National Distillers as a whole, that's where their money came in. So it's fascinating to me to hear you say that the spirits that they were producing during that time period were top-notch produced. They must have had some passionate distillers that weren't going to let this go.
Yeah, again, there's been times where, I have, and I can also send you as well. I still have, I have an 88 and 89 OGD 114. I'd like to send you a sample and then try that compared to like modern day OGD 114, just so you can see the difference in product, the difference in mouthfeel, like the how the flavors roll on the palate. Like it's a night and day difference. And I know my buddy Eric, I'm actually getting ready to fly to Kentucky on Wednesday, but my buddy Eric, who's coming with me, I had sent him a sample of the OGD 114, and he was like, oh my God. He's like, this is insane. It truly is. It is such a different whiskey. I'll make sure I get you a sample of that as well, and we can either, maybe I'll have you on my channel. We can sit and chat.
There you go.
We'll figure something out, but I want you to try it.
Very good. Yeah, that'll be fun, because I think part of this could potentially be the fact that during that time period, bourbon was going through a bit of a depression, and so I'm wondering if that whiskey just aged longer, and that's the reason why when we taste it against today's whiskey, it's not only the ingredients, but it's also the fact that they gave it a little bit longer in the warehouse.
Agree. Yeah, I do think that a lot of the whiskeys, although some of them may be age stated, quote unquote, may have spent a little extra time in some barrels to get some extra age to them. So that could be true, because when you do pour them out side by side, the older OGD 114 is definitely darker than the modern OGD 114.
And it's pretty dark already. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's got to be something. There's got to be something going on there.
So did you have one that you were so looking forward to, and then you tasted it and you went, "Hey, this is not what I expected"?
I had a 1960s Ezra Brooks. I think it was late 60s, if I'm not mistaken. It was a 15-year, dark as all get out. And I remember, taking the first pour out of it, and actually I have two that I can remember. I took it, the first pour of it, and it was so bitter with just oak that I was like, wait a minute. Like, I thought it was just a neck pour, right? So I waited a little bit, let some air get into it, went back to it like a month and a half later, and it still tasted the same. And I was like, I can't even drink this. Like that's how bad it was. It was just so, you think like a 23-year-old like Pappy would be over oak. I'm talking, this is like biting into bark, literally, and chewing on bark. It was so oaky and tannic. There was no other flavors to it. Had the whiskey gone bad, possibly. The fill level on it was still decent. It wasn't completely full. So there may have been a little bit of evap, but just overall, definitely a bad experience. I knew it was the bottle, because later on in my journey, I was able to find another bottle of that and tried it, and it was completely different. So must have been the bottle, the evap. Same thing happened to me with a bottled and bond Jim Beam. And an older, I think it was a late 60s bottled and bond Jim Beam. I opened it up, and it was just like getting as many spices in your mouth, like dry spices in your mouth as possible, and just like pouring it in there. It was so spicy and just off-putting. I did the same thing. I waited like a month and a half. I went back to it. Same thing. It never changed, never like kind of flattened out. I even tested it for the proof to make sure it was legit. There's gonna be some of those whiskeys that you get that are just, it may have been off. Maybe that was the bottom of that barrel back in the day. You know what I mean? Maybe it just had all this junk, and so it happens from time to time. You're gonna find bottles that are just not good, and that's the risk you take when you go down that dusty rabbit hole. So.
Well, it was really interesting, because when that Old Taylor that I have the bottle of back there, that was one I brought back with me, and I was over at Huber's Starlight in Indiana, and had such a great tour over there. I'm like, I have a bottle of almost 100-year-old whiskey. You want to taste it? And of course, they're like, yeah, sure. Who's going to turn that down? So we're in there, we're doing the tasting, we're tasting it, and it was really a cool moment, because just watching somebody else for the first time getting to really experience something like that. The second time I drank it, I really paid much more attention to it. I was not in the moment as much, and I was really just tasting it for tasting it. And it was so funny, because here's this 103-year-old whiskey, and I went, tastes a little young, which I think would shock a lot of people. And I've said that to some people about that experience that I had with it. But when I looked at it, and we're talking about the history of a bottle, that bottle was distilled, the whiskey was distilled in 1914. And because of Prohibition in Kentucky, I think what they had to do was they had to quick get the stuff into bottles and ship it out. So it's only 4 years old. And a lot of these Dusties you get are 6, 7, 8, 9, and up in terms of age. And so it actually, for what Frankfurt was putting out at that time, it probably was a young whiskey. And that's kind of, I imagine you find that experience a lot on some of these whiskeys, that there will be a youth to them that you just almost don't expect.
Very true. And surprisingly enough, the younger bottles of dusty whiskey, those 4-year-olds and those 5-year-olds, you get way more grain flavor on those than you would a young whiskey in modern times. I think there's more there's, and it sounds kind of crazy, but I think there's more ways to mask that youthful flavor in modern day as opposed to back then. Because back then, I don't think they even knew how to mask a flavor at that point, right? So like, today there's tons of different ways to mask flavors from young whiskey. You could double oak something, you can, do whatever it may be. And I think a lot of times, and I agree with you completely. I've had a couple Dusties that were young, and it's just like, it's literally like chewing on some corn, right? It's so, it's very youthful and young, and that happens. And there were times back then, surprisingly enough, where they put stuff in steel vats and let it sit. That way it didn't age. Obviously they couldn't do that with all their whiskey because that would take up a ton of space, but there were times where they put stuff in steel vats and then kind of bring it back out after Prohibition had ended. So
would you get a metallic taste out of it?
It's happened. Yeah, indeed. Yep. So it's I've tasted a few that have kind of given you that vibe a little bit, where you get that kind of metallic-y taste, and it's like, very, very off-putting. But there are times too when there was stuff that was put in steel vats that didn't have that taste, surprisingly enough. So I don't know if it was the filtration that they used or whatever it may have been that kind of offset that flavor profile from happening. So
that's what just amazes me about when I do this research. And like, I was looking up a distiller, James A. Miller, who distilled in Paris in Bourbon County, and in 1854, I found an article or a ad for his whiskey that said, "We have in stock barrels of 15-year-old whiskey." And I'm thinking, it's really interesting that back then they kept them in those barrels for that period of time because they weren't bottling the stuff. And just this idea of what that older whiskey would taste like versus what even when we're going back and tasting these, what are turning into concentrated whiskeys because of the evaporation,
From what I understand, and I've done research as well, and I've heard some stories about, when they did have to keep things in barrels, they kept them underground in places, basements or whatever, where there was no heat. So it basically kept the barrels cool. That way it would prevent more evaporation, more angel share, and then being able to bring some of that whiskey back out. So I did read a story. I'd have to go back and try to find that article. But I did read about that. There was times where they stored it like under barns and stuff like that, and then kind of brought it back up. So I found that to be very interesting, that they knew that keeping this whiskey in the heat and the cold, you're going to come out with nothing in the end. So they had to find a way to keep it besides the steel vat. So,
well, a lot of the Scotch distillers, what they'll do is if they want something to get to the 50th anniversary and it's getting to a perfect flavor profile at 40 years, they'll just put it in a 3, 4, 5 times used cask that has nothing left to it and can't impart any more flavors on it. Then evaporation is really the only thing you have to worry about at that point. So there are tricks.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So that's how they can get to all those zeros when they get to all those milestones.
Yep.
So we have all of these whiskeys sitting over here, and I'm going to get ready to dive into the first one here. But before we do, there's a lot of people. I don't want to say I'm on a crusade, but I hear people bragging about age statements on whiskeys. Mm-hmm. And one of the whiskey families that gets talked about the most is Pappy Van Winkle. And you actually had the opportunity to, what did you taste? The 15, the 21, and the 23?
15, 20, and 23, yeah. But the 20 and the 23 were actually sent to me. I didn't have those. I did have the 15.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was able to kind of try those, side by side. So
yeah,
that was a pretty neat experience. So
my question to you after you did that was just how oaky were those? Because I've heard people say that if you're not an oak fan, you're probably. I mean, I've had the 15. I've had the no. What did I have? I had the 15 Rip, not the Pappy, and I like the 15 Rip.
Yeah, so the 20 to me was the oakiest of the bunch. Surprisingly.
Was it really?
It was. If I remember correctly, I think the 20 was the oakiest one for me. The 23 felt more balanced. It was definitely had an oaky profile to it, but it felt more balanced out than the 20 did. The 20 just felt like it was just way too over oaked. And I've tried a couple different whiskeys that with those higher age statements. I had a really bad bottle of Elijah Craig 18 that came off just so tannic and just so oak forward. I just couldn't enjoy it. But no, it was really nice to kind of see the differences between the years, but very surprising for the 20 to the 23 that the 20 was, had way more of an oak profile than the 23 did. So for me anyway.
Yeah. It's great that somebody finally did that. So if anybody wants to see that experience, it's on your YouTube channel, Dusty Dan's Whiskey Reviews. So definitely an education. And it was for me. I was really looking forward to learning more, because I talked to somebody I've talked to several people about it actually, who was, I had a 23-year-old Pappy, and they go, okay, so what'd you think? Okay, well, probably a little bit more oaky than I would normally drink. But again, it comes down to an experience too. And I think for a lot of people, if I were in, let's say I was in Louisville, or I was at, in Washington at Jack Rose, and they had it, and it was going to cost me, $80 to $100 or whatever. It's probably much higher than that now to have a pour of it. What I like about was it Doc Crow's in Louisville is they do half pours. Yeah. So that's a nice thing. Just give it a try. Give it a try. See what you think, but don't spend $800. Well, and again, I say $800 because I remember when I first started getting into whiskey about 4 years ago. I walked into a whiskey shop, and they said, we're doing a raffle for our Pappy 23 when it comes in. And I said, well, how much does it usually sell for? And they said $800 a bottle. So that is penciled in my brain. But what was the last price you saw probably on that?
On the 23, I think it's much higher now. I think you're getting up into like and again, I don't shop for those. But I swear I saw one for like at least like 1600, something like that. Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. Like for me, it's definitely a bottle I would never shop for. Again, like now, to be honest, if I found it at retail, I would probably buy it. And I know it sounds horrible, I'd probably get rid of it because I enjoyed the 15. I really did. The 15 I think is the best of the bunch. Again, the 20 and the 23 are just the 23 was balanced, but the amount of money that they want for it is just not. It's just not worth it in my opinion. But if money doesn't mean anything to you, then Pappy away,
So I did a little preparation for our tasting here that we're doing. I actually have been jumping through old newspapers and trying to find newspapers from the time period to see how they were selling these particular whiskeys. So awesome. The first one that we're going to jump into is the Special Old Reserve. Now, the bottle that you got was 1916 for distillation, and then 1933. So this is a 17-year-old whiskey, 100 proof, bottled in bond, and interesting that I was seeing that they were selling just three different styles of this. They had a 16, a 17, and an 18. So you got the one that was right in the middle. It was $2.79 a pint in 1934. Wow. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but I think that would be $22 for a pint today. Okay. So that's for 17-year-old whiskey. I guess I could see that. What surprised me though was the 4-year-old Old Overholt was almost the same price as that. So
really,
yeah, I was pretty surprised by that. But it sold it as being made before Prohibition.
Yes. And look how dark that is too. Oh,
it is. And this is this would have come out of the Henderson, Kentucky distillery that is basically the great grandfather of Corky Taylor over at Peerless, Kentucky Peerless. So, and I actually a little nosing and tasting of this. This is the only one I don't have a full glass of with him, which was really interesting to have that opportunity. But what's interesting? Well, go ahead.
So if you go there on a tour, if you go look at the tour on one of the walls, they have a picture of one of those 1917 Special Reserve bottles sitting there on the wall, that's awesome to see that.
They're very cool looking bottles too.
Yes.
They used to. It's like looking at old architecture. They were so much more ornate with the way they did bottles back then.
So much more, and not only that, but I think the artwork is way cooler too. Like for instance, right, you got this like old Quaker bottle here. You know, just like the artwork's just really cool looking, right? Shinley produced, old Quaker. It's got all those like nice kind of. I know it's hard to see, but the engraving there on the back.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I know it's kind of hard to see, but
yeah.
I just think the artwork too was really cool. And again, you know, you're talking about the Old Crow, the chess piece, right, or the Jim Beam bowling pin, right? Like,
right.
Very, very different. I mean, the decanters that they used back then. That's what they need to bring back today. I'm calling it now. Let's bring it back. Let's bring it back.
Absolutely. Well, you know, the problem is that they've got so much whiskey that will be out on the market here pretty soon, since everybody's going so high on capacity, that I think they're going to just be trying to sell it, let alone try to figure out a special bottle to put it in. But so what's interesting with older whiskeys, I got kind of a mint off of that. I love when something hits me all of a sudden that
surprises you. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't smell that before, but it's kind of like you're not overly paying attention to it, and suddenly something just hits you. And there's a mustiness that comes in some of these old whiskeys. Now, of course, this is a 17-year-old whiskey, so it likely sat in a warehouse for a decent amount of time, and who knows how many different seasons of good and bad weather it went through to get that.
Here's the part that really like kind of just messes with me, right? Is how many people passed by that bottle that I had? How many people had it in their hands and were like, maybe not this one, let's grab this one. And from time to time, if that liquor store closed up, where did it go? Did it move on to the next? Was it in somebody's personal collection, right? Like the whole history of where it was located, and that to me is kind of something special too. Just to think about how many people passed by that individual bottle.
Yeah, I wonder if you ever saw, there was on Saturday Night Live a long time ago. This was probably Eddie Murphy era. I think it was, because Joe Piscopo, I think, was the guy that was in it. It was a history of a paperclip. And so basically they're showing that, he's pulling the paperclip off of his memo, and it goes onto another memo, and it goes off, and somehow it ends up in Vietnam. And there's a guy who's like got his leg blown off, and he's using this paperclip to sit here and do surgery on the guy. It starts off as actually he pulls out the paperclip, and he's going to pick his teeth with it. And they say, "Do you know where that paperclip has been?" And then they go into the history of the paperclip. And so they show all this stuff, all these horrible things that happen to it. And then at the end, they're like, "So you still want to pick your teeth with that paperclip?" He looks at it and goes, "Eh," and then starts picking. Yeah. But that's it. It's kind of that, what is that journey for, and how the heck did that bottle survive? Now, I know on my two bottles, the Old Tailor and the Hermitage, and that was what was fascinating about those, was learning their history, because they were actually purchased by the only liquor dealer in the Los Angeles area, and that he had been trying to stock up before Prohibition, not knowing what was going to happen. And then his kids didn't care about whiskey, so it just sat in vaults. He was a banker too, so he had bank vaults in his house, and they just sat in the bank vault for all that time. And so it's like when you say provenance, I can tell you exactly what those things have been through. But these other whiskeys, how do you know?
Exactly. Yeah, and that's kind of where for me, especially if I could find something through my friends, right, like that group of guys that I trust, again, who find these things and it can always provide the provenance of it, I'll gladly go through them. But it wasn't too many years back. A guy I know went and renovated a home, and I think it was in New York, if I'm not mistaken. And as they were tearing out the walls, they have found a ton. It was actually in the paper, a ton of whiskey. A ton of old whiskey that was, and they had like they took a picture of all these whiskeys on like this table that they found. If you look it up, I can't remember where it was. I want to say it was in New York though. But yeah, if you type in like major whiskey stash found in home,
Yeah.
I'm sure it'll pop up.
I think I've read that article. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they thought it was during Capone's era.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
And then I mean, so there's times where you got to remember like there was collectors back then too, where they had their bars downstairs, and maybe maybe they passed away, and then one was like whoever it was like, hey, do you put these things up for sale? Nobody wants them anymore. So they've been stored down in bars and basements where the temperature's been fairly regulated. So that's those bottles just sit until somebody like you or I are like, hey, we'll take them.
Yeah. Well, I was renovating an old house, and when I pulled out the old medicine cabinet, behind it, all I found were a bunch of old razor blades, rusty old razor. Because basically back then they used to use the straight razor to shave, and then they had a little slot in the back of the medicine cabinet, and they would just slide it in, and it would go into the wall.
Well, interesting. That's wild.
Whiskey would have been much nicer than that. So this almost has like a mushroomy kind of smell to me.
Earthy.
It is very earthy.
Yeah.
And then there's that little bit of wood and little wood note in there.
I get some leather on the nose for sure, though, like a binding, if you will.
It's actually kind of cool to be nosing the same 90-year-old whiskey over the internet and sharing this moment.
It's crazy too, because I mean, in the placement where you put your nose, like you put your nose like on the bottom of the glass. I get something different from when you put my nose closer to the top of the glass. It's very weird. I get the minty note when I put my nose at the higher portion of the glass.
Yeah, I get a little chocolate note in there too, actually.
Yeah, I guess so, I can definitely see that.
So it's interesting because the other way to think of this is the guy who was distilling this on whatever day he was distilling it, and he had no idea that 90 years from now somebody would be tasting the fruits of his labor.
Right.
It is absolutely crazy.
It's very crazy to think, for sure. I mean, just never knowing who it would be, but that someone would be enjoying it for sure.
I actually got cherry on that when it first hit my palate. Interesting. Peppery when it gets to the end, though. Warm. But it's all it's on the tongue. It's not what you expect these days where you get that Kentucky hug.
Right.
It's so peppery and just kind of lays there.
And those are the type of whiskeys that I like, and I talk about in a lot of my reviews is those whiskeys that kind of saturate the palate. They kind of soak in on the cheeks and the tongue, on the soft palate in the back. That's the kind of whiskey that I like, because those flavors just kind of linger around for a while. Not necessarily that Kentucky hug, but they linger around in the mouth. So love it.
Yeah. Oh, that is amazing, actually. And I would take that over a 4-year-old old overhold. Although I haven't had that 4-year-old old over. It's hard to know. All right, so cleanse the palate a little bit, and then the next one we're going to go for, and of course I can build this up a little bit. The next one is a whiskey that has come back to the market, and I don't think you have this one to taste along with me, but it is the Cream of Kentucky, 1956.
Do I have that with me? I don't have that one here. That is at the house.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have that one with me, unfortunately.
So I will be on my own on this one. But Jim Rutledge, who was the master distiller at Four Roses, has gone out on his own and is doing a modern Cream of Kentucky. It was interesting reading the history on this because I went a couple of different routes. Of course, Michael Veach writes about, so you can usually find him doing a little write-up on an older whiskey. And
yes.
He had mentioned that this was a brand that started in 1891, the Edel Brothers. But then if you look at Jim Rutledge's website, it says I. Traeger and Company from Cincinnati, Ohio in 1888, so 3 years before that. But I found an advertisement from 1900 that shows that it is from 1879 was when the brand started, saying oldest and finest. And then in for its selling point, it said, best and purest for medicinal and family use. Which, hello, kids, come on over. We're going to be doing a little sipping here on this. So,
great.
and that's not the first time I've seen that. Actually, what was I studying not too long ago? There was a thing where as temperance was growing, and yeah, that's where it came from. There was a Cincinnati preacher who was giving out the reasons why around 1880 whiskey was a bad idea for giving to your kids. But that was a regular practice because they said you need to get your kids used to it when they're younger so that when they get older, they can drink it and they won't be abusing it. That was their idea, was that you were building the kids up and giving them a tolerance, but also teaching them to respect it from an early age. So family use was actually an issue back in the 1880s.
That's crazy to think, right? And I mean, from what I've researched as well, is that we don't drink as much as they drank back when. You know, I mean, they were going through. I forget the numbers off the top of my head, but it was vastly different from what we consume now. So
yes, well, from probably up until about 1820. People, I think, mainly drank whiskey responsibly, but there was a time period in British history when they had what was called the gin craze, and all of a sudden cheap gin was hitting the market, and people were just getting soused on cheap gin, and that created an issue. Of course, you can produce gin without having to wait for it to age, so they could just flood the market with gin. And it was just interesting that around the same time in the U.S., the temperance movement came about mainly because all of a sudden whiskey was a problem and they had to do something. And at first they were like, well, we're just gonna suggest people, drink less. That's all you need to do. Just drink less. But nobody was listening. Everybody was drinking more and more. So they're like, okay, no, sorry. We gotta prohibit it altogether. You just can't handle it. So this is interesting too, because then I found an ad from 56, and I wanted to get a better idea of the whiskey. Now, this is a rectified whiskey. It is a whiskey that came along with George T. Stagg. It was actually made at the old Stagg distillery when Shinley owned the Stagg distillery, which is Buffalo Trace now. And for some reason, Albert Blanton decided that this was a whiskey that was worth holding on to. So it came back out in the 50s. It was never a top shelf whiskey. It's being sold by Jim Rutledge now as a premier whiskey. But during its lifetime, it was never really sold as that. In fact, this whiskey is 70% neutral grain spirits. And you had it at 80 proof. They said theirs were 86 proof. Of course, you don't have the bottled, so we can't confirm. But it's also said it was four-year-old. But this was $44 a quart in today's money.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was not a cheap whiskey. But they called this America's finest value whiskey. But it was $4 a quart, which would be $44 in today's money.
Wow.
So whiskey was apparently a lot more expensive back then than I thought it was.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm pretty certain that was 80 proof. I can double check on it though, but because I know at some point they had that run of 80 proofers, but then they did have the 86 as well. But I'll go back and double check that just to make sure that it's not 86 proof.
So this is an interesting one, very different from the other one. This one is much more of like a citrusy orange kind of a note I get on this.
Tons of citrus on that cream of Kentucky. Yeah, that was that's still probably one of the easiest sipping Dusties that I've owned. So
nice.
And I poured a little bit of the 1969 J.W. Dant. So this is a 10-year-old whiskey that is 86 proof, and it comes in the. This is the 50th anniversary, so it's in the cool like cobalt blue bottle.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, really nice. From 1919 to 1969, American Legion 50th anniversary.
Oh, very cool.
Yes, it's very bubblegum forward on the nose on this one. That's kind of like the that's the note that everybody gets on the nose on this one. It's like like a bubblegum.
So who was making J.W. Dant back then? Was it from the Yosemite distillery?
No, this was this
Already
is
Heaven Hill?
I want to say it was out of I think it was the Dant distillery, but I think it was distilled out of Aladdin, yeah, PA and Fresno, California. So it was bottled by the Dant distillery.
Okay.
4 quart, 86 proof.
Which is always, when you see by such and such distillery, what I have learned now is that basically they'll buy the distillery name, or they'll get the distillery name and then incorporate the distillery name, but never build a distillery for it.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, because actually what was interesting in doing my research, the Chicken Cock brand, when it, in 1927, they actually were opening up and going to allow a lot more medicinal licenses. And so it was actually purchased in Baltimore, Maryland, to have the Chicken Cock Distillery Company. That's cool. that was licensed in Baltimore. And actually, when
that's my hometown.
Is it? Okay, well, cool. So,
yeah.
So what's interesting is that when it came back out, it came out as a Pennsylvania rye, but it came out of the Baltimore distillery.
Interesting. That's
yeah,
weird.
Yeah. So crazy stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. Like and there's always been a big debate as to what rye is better: Old Maryland rye, or Old Pennsylvania rye. Maryland ryes come off way sweeter than the Pennsylvania ryes. Oh yeah. I mean, it's again, Pennsylvania ryes, especially back then, were very kind of spicy, spice driven, whereas Maryland ryes were always like very, very sweet. So
yeah,
and it's true because I have a handful of them that are from Maryland. So definitely a much sweeter profile.
I was gonna say my understanding with that too is that Maryland rye has more corn in it. Is that right?
Yeah, I believe that's correct.
Yeah, and I remember it by the fact that they say the further north you get, the harder it is to grow corn. So it would make sense that, Pennsylvania would use less corn. And
yes,
it gets confused because you have Rittenhouse rye, which is barely rye whiskey.
Yeah.
And it says Pennsylvania style, but I don't know that necessarily is Pennsylvania style.
Pennsylvania rye. Yeah, I agree.
So we have to get past the marketers every once in a while. It's just it's such a fragrant nose, and there's the vanilla coming through too. It's almost like a creamsicle kind of a smell on this.
Yep.
And then you got a peppery note, but when it finishes quick. It's like it fades away. The liquid gets very light, so it's like you can tell that neutral grain spirit and the shorter age on it from the fact that it's dissipating so quickly on the palate.
Yeah, and that to me, like, those whiskeys are always the ones where, like, I want to go back for more because that flavor's gone. Go back for more. So I'm still sipping. I finished that Dant, but I'm still sipping on that the Special Old Reserve.
Nice. Did you have you met Wally Dant?
I have not.
Okay. Well, he would love to see that bottle, I bet. Or maybe he has seen that bottle already. But so very cool to
see if I can find a way to reach out to him some way.
Yeah. Well, of course, you can always connect through me.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we can do that for sure.
So next up on the list is Wild Turkey. And this is a 1976. And this one came out of a decanter. So what was the decanter that this came out of?
That is the Old Turkey Lore decanter. So it was 1976. It was a Turkey Lore decanter. It's still 8 years, 101 proof. But and this has always kind of like fascinated me is if you were to pour a Wild Turkey 8-year 101 into a glass, and you were to go grab one of those Wild Turkey decanters, the color difference is mind blowing. The stuff that comes out of the decanter is so much darker than your standard 101, way darker. It's way darker than what comes out of the bottle, and I don't understand why. That looks dark. That looks very
it is,
very
it
dark.
is very dark. Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't understand why. Maybe is it because there's no light going through? There's no light going through the decanter. Is it? I mean, the process had to be the same, unless it's an older whiskey like we talked about earlier. Unless it's age stated, it may be, or maybe it's 12 years old, but they claimed that it was 8 years old.
Right.
Not 100% sure on that. But if you were to pour a regular pour 101, the color difference is night and day. So.
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing I could think is if they actually were using color in it, but I think even at that time, colorant was a no-no in American whiskey.
Then, yeah.
So, yeah. The barrels they're using, that's the only other thing I could think that maybe they either stored these in a place where they got more aggressive. I mean, that's almost 114 old granddad depth of color.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. I just, to me, that's always kind of, and it's not only with Wild Turkey, but like you get into some of the old Jim Beam decanters, or the Ezra Brooks decanters, or the McCormick's, all of them. I mean, just the whiskey is so much darker when they come out of there. It's very weird.
Yeah, they bleach in the sunlight. The other ones. Who knows? That's really strange. So
it is.
So this is an interesting one because I did not know enough of the background on this, and Rare Bird 101, his website's really pretty handy. So yes. I found a little bit of background information on this. So it is an 8-year whiskey. It says bottled by, and so it doesn't say made by or distilled by. And so this ran him down this trail of, okay, what does that mean? Does that mean where did this whiskey actually come from? Well, then he writes that the Old Rippy Boulevard Distillery in Tyrone wasn't purchased until 1971, and this is 1976, and it's 8 years old.
Yep.
So it is sourced whiskey. It came from somewhere else, and we have no idea where this came from. So I guess this would be more down to Jimmy Russell's palate, maybe, than it would be to his distilling prowess or whoever was picking out the casks that they wanted to have for doing this, or where they were aging it.
That's the whole mystery behind some of these, is where did it come from? Because I mean, everything you just talked about was true. So it's, that was distilled prior to it, being turkey, and it was, was it out of the Old Rippy? I mean, was it, it's so hard to say. I mean, it could be anywhere, and that's the where like my inner kind of nerdiness comes out, is I always want to find out like where it came from, who owned it, who it was distilled by. But some of that information is just, it's so hard to find, it really is. It's very difficult to find sometimes.
So what's fascinating about this is when I have a Wild Turkey 101, I expect some rye notes, and I don't really get any rye notes out of this. No.
It's so different on the palate too, to me. So you'll see when you taste it. It's very, very different. Very different.
It's got kind of it's got that musty note, but it's only a light musty note. Mm-hmm. It's got a little tobacco. It's got a little leather. It even has a little bit of that citrus note in it. It's got some sweetness to it. It's like just a really nice blend of a bunch of different scents.
Yep.
It's a really nice.
Yeah, it's and I've had a couple decanters from Turkey, a handful, and every single one of them is the same. They're all the same. So like when I first got one, I had poured it out because I wanted it out of the decanter, so I put it into a bottle, and I looked at it and I was like, this is really dark. Like this is very, very dark. And I put it next to a modern day Turkey 101. Looked at it and I was like, wow, this is odd. And then I put it next to another Turkey, and I was like, well, wait a minute. Like this is even darker than that stuff. So it's always been on my mind as to why all of this whiskey is so much darker in the decanters than it is the bottle.
Yeah. So really nice, like brown sugar and baking spices in this one. And then it gets you with the rye. If it's showing up at all, it's that heat on the tongue again.
Yeah. And
it's so funny because it's like it doesn't really necessarily taste like rye. It's just the effect of rye. kind of coming through to me, which is really, really interesting.
Just that bite.
Yeah. And now after tasting it, the musty note is like way out front. It's amazing how once you taste something and you get it on your palate, other scents just really come popping out at you.
Yep. Yeah, I mean that's and that's the kind of history too, where I'll have to reach out to some of my some of my resources and contacts and ask them and see if they know any of the history of it, because there's people out there that know way more than I do. So
yeah,
and it's I like the fact that I can continue to learn from them and figure out where they gain their resources from, the books or whatever it may be. So I'm always trying to find that that next kind of thing to look into as far as research for older stuff. So
yeah. Well, before we jump in and do the last whiskey, which is the Hermitage, talk a little bit. You just actually came out with your own bottle of whiskey, and is this something we're going to see a lot more of? And talk about what it is that you put out there.
Yeah, so I had partnered with Brian Treacy over at Sagamore, who obviously he's maybe 10 minutes down the street. So I have a great relationship with him, and told him at one point that I really wanted to kind of I would love to have a pick, my own pick of a Sagamore rye, and so I was able to partner with someone over at Shared Pour, and from there they kind of worked out the logistics together, and I partnered with Jason from the Mash and Drum and Scott from My Bourbon Journey, partnered with those guys, and we were sent some samples from Brian to try, and we found one that we thought that a lot of people would enjoy, and took a couple of weeks to actually get go through the whole process and get it bottled, and from there we just kind of spread the word, all of us kind of spread the word on it, and it sold out. So it took a little over 60 days to finally sell out. So and it's definitely something I look to continue to do, through my platform. But then we're also, I want to touch base on this really quick too. Is I'm one of the founding members of an organization called Barrels for Hope, and Barrels for Hope is it's a charity-based nonprofit organization, and what it is we have a relationship with a liquor store in Illinois where we're allotted X amount of barrels for picks. And so we came up with this plan and this group to donate all proceeds to charities. Those charities are Folds of Honor for the military, Make-A-Wish Foundation, Breast Cancer Awareness, and then She Writes Love on Her Arms, I believe, for mental awareness. So that's what I'm going to Kentucky for on Wednesday, is to go do our first Barrels for Hope pick, which is an Eliza Craig barrel proof pick.
Oh, nice.
So we have 140 members right now, and there's a fee to join, and again that fee obviously goes toward buying the barrel, and then the bottles they receive their bottle, that's part of their payment, and then the only money outside of what goes to the charities is for our operating expenses. But yes, so we're looking to raise 40,000 plus this year for those charities, and then next year we're looking to kind of build on top of that. So we'll be doing some barrel picks through that as well. So
okay, so how does somebody find out more information on that?
So you can go to barrelsforhope.com. We do have a website. There is a way to RSVP under that website. And when you get in, we don't have any opening spots right now, but when you do get in, you'll pay a monthly fee, but that monthly fee also includes, that's your bottle, that also includes your shipping, and the money that we accumulate once we actually are fully up and running, will also pay for your stay when you're picked to go on one of our barrel picks. So we look to kind of cycle through everybody to go on these barrel picks with us for that experience. So all that kind of stuff is incorporated into that monthly payment. So
very nice.
Yes, a lot of fun. So
It's always good to figure out how to give back when doing all of this.
It is, it's definitely a process though. I never thought that I was going to be, a secretary of a nonprofit organization like that. But there's a lot of different things you have to go through to actually get this thing approved, up and running, and the logistics of it, and the financial part and all that. But luckily we have 3 other great members, and one of them is very familiar with all of those processes as well, as he does something like that for another organization as well. So
okay.
Very lucky and proud to be a part of that. So
a lot of legal stuff you have to take care of with alcohol.
Absolutely. Yep.
Wish that could be a little easier, but
yes.
All right. So this last whiskey we're going to jump into, you have not tasted or nosed this yet?
Nope.
Okay. So this is a 1914 distilled Hermitage. 1923 is when it was bottled. So this was bottled specifically to be a medicinal whiskey. So you had to have a prescription to be able to buy this. Now, there's some interesting and unique things about this, because I've talked with Todd about this, and he had, I think, found a bottle of Hermitage that was a local. And when I say local, this was distilled in Frankfort, Kentucky, right down from where Buffalo Trace is. This is actually, if you know where the Capitol building is in Frankfort, it's right along the bend of the river. There is where the old distillery used to be, completely gone now. It was part of the E.H. Taylor, W.A. Gaines organization. Taylor would have been alive when this was made, which is always kind of a cool thing to think about. That's what made it so chilling to be up there sipping this while we're up by his gravesite. Now, but what makes this really interesting and different is that because this traveled out to California, it has its own little story, which is after it was distilled, it was put in barrels and shipped out on train. So you think about it going on a train from Frankfort, Kentucky, all the way out to Los Angeles, California in 1914. And then once it gets there, it gets put into warehouses in California and ages in California for 9 years. So what would be fascinating is to taste this versus tasting one that stayed in Kentucky and was 9 years. Because we talk about Jefferson's Oceans at Sea and Kyo whiskey and all these other whiskeys that are, putting their whiskeys on boats, or Metallica beating sound waves into a whiskey to try to get flavor in it. Imagine being on a rickety old railroad track going all the way out to Los Angeles, California, some 2,500 miles. And what kind of a condition that whiskey is going to be in just by the time it gets there, not even talking about the 9 extra years that it's going to. Yeah.
Yep.
And then this sat in a bottle. What was interesting about this is that it sat in that vault. The vault, I've seen pictures of it. I didn't get a chance to see the vault when it was still full, but these were crates that had not been opened yet. So they had all of these crates of Old Taylor, Old Crow, Hermitage, and they're all sitting in these big crates. They had to bring out a crowbar to open them up and pull these bottles out. Some of them, the labels looked like this. Some of them, the labels were pristine and no issues. So something broke open in there, apparently, at one point or something. They were all at different fill levels, and so when they contacted Christie's came out, and they did what you talked about doing, which is they inspected the bottles, and then they said, if the fill level is too low, we can't take it. If the label is too beat up, we can't take it. And so the ones that they left behind, I was lucky enough to get one that the fill level's a little bit low on it, but the label looks great. And then I got this one that looks horrible, but I have enjoyed most of it was probably about there, I think, when I got that whiskey. And it has been a pleasure to share this with people, because, again, the idea of sharing a 100-year-old whiskey with people and seeing their faces light up when they're tasting it, and that amazed look they get on their face because how different this tastes from,
Completely agree.
yeah, yeah. So, cheers, my friend. Let's
Cheers,
take
man. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. See, that's one of those whiskeys that just it hits the palate differently.
mm.
Yeah,
I
that
get,
is. See, on this one, man, this one gets me like on the back of the palate.
mm-hmm. It's all on
There,
the
there's
back of
some
the palate.
yeah, there's some nice flavors up at the front, but then on the back of the palate, it's just like saturated right there.
Yeah. I got a cola note big time when it first hit
There's
the,
definitely I was gonna say there's definitely like a cola note. It's almost like a, I know it's kind of weird to say, but almost like a sassafras, like a, you know, almost like root beer, almost like a root beerish
absolutely.
kind of there. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
This one actually has a decent finish on it, and the flavor doesn't go away as quickly as I thought.
Yeah. I tasted this the other day, and just being in a different room, sometimes you'll get a different flavor. And I got a lot more oakiness out of it the other day, which I thought made sense because it sat so much time, sat so long in a barrel and went on that cross country trip. But it's not as oaky today when I'm tasting it.
I do see that oak. I definitely get the oakiness on it, but it's not definitely not over oaked.
It's not overpowering. Yeah, yeah.
No, definitely not. But that sassafras cola note is definitely present, even on the second sip.
But on the nose, it's almost got this gassy kind of smell to it. It's really,
it is pungent on the nose, but man, when you get to the palate, it's like wow. I mean, none of that reflects onto the palate whatsoever. And I saved myself some. I didn't pour all of it, so man, that is and it's oily.
yeah.
I'm looking at my glass and it's just like oily legs all down it. Man, that's actually really good. That's very good. The flavors kind of sit there and saturate. Definitely it's kind of sweeter for me up front, and then onto the back, that's when it goes into like this leathery oak sassafras kind of note, and then there's like this pepperyish bite that kind of flows through into the finish. There's actually a nice finish on this one.
Yeah. But some of that kind of oiliness just lays all around the palate as well. It doesn't.
It does. It saturates it completely. I mean, just all over. Like you said, the size of the cheek, the soft palate.
Yeah.
And those are the whiskeys that I love because I mean, you can just kind of roll your tongue around and kind of extract those flavors after that finish is gone, just to kind of bring them back a little bit.
Yeah.
That's a special pour, man. Thank you for that. I much appreciated.
Well, thank you again for all of these. This has been great going through all. And I will say that it's really great to taste whiskeys with someone who is into it as much as you are because, it's like a mutual appreciation here. Absolutely. And I think whiskeys taste better when you're tasting whiskeys with people who are, passionate about their whiskeys too.
You're absolutely right. And that's it is something I'm very passionate about. I take a lot of pride in it. And again, I mean, I think sharing and having that experience means more than anything else. So, and that's why when I open these bottles, I just created a Patreon account, and for my top tiers, they one of the benefits they receive is a personal sample from me every month of stuff that I kind of keep in my vault. So, and all that stuff is going to be some of this older stuff that I just enjoy sharing with people, and it makes the experience. It makes the experience just worth it in general. I mean, like tonight, like this is an amazing experience to sit here with you and be able to talk about these old whiskeys and sit here and try them together. I wish I would have brought the turkey and the creamy Kentucky, but this is really nice. I really enjoyed this Old Hermitage right here. This is really good.
Fantastic.
Well, it has a great nose to it. After you finish it, man, that's like That's like sassafras, leather oak on the nose, like old rick house. Oh, that's great.
I've got what's fun too is that I'll taste this again in the future, and those tasting notes will stick in my head. It's like sometimes you just get stumped on something, and it's like there are things that clearly come through, but other things that you're going, okay, there's a muddle in my head right now, and I can't quite put my finger on what that specific taste is. Fantastic.
I'll tell you, there's been some times where I've tried some older whiskey, and I can't even identify what that flavor is. You know, it's not all the time, you know, but
Yeah.
it's, you know, certain brands that are kind of like those off brands. Like you taste it and it's like what is this? Or you taste it and it's like it just such a mix of flavors, like a you know, like a star anise and then like lemon peel and then, you know, a little bit of butterscotch on the end. It's like, how in the world did this even happen? You know?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the beauty of it, is you really never know what you know what you're going to taste when you crack those older bottles open. So, you know.
Well, and that's the thing too about kind of opening your mind up and looking beyond those flavors that you expect in a whiskey and finding. I mean, I remember the other day I found rhubarb in a whiskey for the first time. I'm like, wow, there's a flavor I really didn't think that I was going to ever see in a whiskey. But and what's funny is that I haven't had rhubarb since I was a kid, but I'm drinking whiskey and it's taking me back to being a kid.
That's awesome though. That's the kind of things that I kind of crave about finding these things. You know, it's just like something that reminds me of like my grandmother's cookies she used to make, or something that that I remember that my mom used to make, something like that. Like, and that's what kind of brings back those memories. So I kind of related to that when I taste whiskey, is like, what does this remind me of? You know, that I've tasted through time, and that's, you know, that's how I relate to when I taste whiskey. So
yeah. So if people want to watch and learn more about you, where are the best places to reach out to you?
Yeah, so I have, you can reach out to me on Instagram at Dusty_Dans_whiskey_reviews. I couldn't, unfortunately I couldn't keep the whole name without the underscore. So, Dusty Dan's Whiskey Reviews on Instagram, and I do have a YouTube channel called Dusty Dan's Whiskey Reviews, and you know, I collaborate with a lot of distilleries, a lot of craft distilleries as well. I have great relationships with them, and lately, you know, this year I've been doing a lot of live streams where I have some friends on and do some blind tastings and stuff. So, you know, continue to you know, I'll continue to do that, you know, do the live streams and stuff, and still kind of reach out and collaborate with the you know, those distilleries, the craft distilleries, and you know, I've had some. I'm going to have Brian Treacy on the channel next month. So Brian's going to come on the channel. I have a Owen. Owen's going to be on from Lock and Company. So Lock and Company is based out of Colorado.
Okay.
He'll be coming on the channel. I had I interviewed Mike Montgomery and Trey Wade from Blue Run Spirits. I had them on the channel. Had an interview with them. So kind of looking to do that as well, just to you know, just to have them on the channel, kind of explain, you know, what's going on in the whiskey world through their eyes, and that's kind of where I'm looking to go for the rest of this year. So I'm looking forward to having you on, though, Drew. So
No, well,
that'll be fun.
I'll be there. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
It's fun talking whiskey with you, and I appreciate you taking the time tonight, and look forward to our next get together.
Absolutely, my friend. It won't be. We won't wait as long as we did this time. So.
Sounds good to me. Cheers, friend.
Cheers, my friend.